The call came on a Tuesday morning in late April, while I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold next to me. It was my bank, not a person, an automated alert, the kind you set up and forget about until it actually fires. The message said a wire transfer of $180,000 had been initiated from the Hartwell Freight Solutions operating account the previous afternoon. I sat there for a minute. Then I called Howard Gilmore. My name is Leonard Hartwell. I'm 67 years old. I built a freight logistics company out of a 2-car garage in Fort Wayne, Indiana, starting in 1984. I was 27 years old. I had a used forklift, a pickup truck with 190,000 miles on it, and one client who trusted me because his regular hauler had let him down twice in a row. 40 years later, Hartwell Freight Solutions had 140 employees, 12 long-haul routes through the Midwest and Southeast, and 3 warehouse contracts that brought in just over $2 million a year combined. I say all that not to brag. I say it because you need to understand what was sitting in that operating account, and you need to understand what it meant that $180,000 of it had just walked out the door while I was recovering from open heart surgery. 8 weeks earlier, I had been lying on a table at Lutheran Hospital while a surgeon cracked my chest open and repaired a valve that had been quietly failing for years. The cardiologist had told me in February that I needed the procedure, not next year. Now, I was not afraid of the surgery. What I was afraid of was leaving the business unprotected for the 6 to 8 weeks I would be out of commission. We had contracts with deadlines. We had vendors who needed approvals. We had payroll running every 2 weeks. None of that stops because the owner is sedated. So I made a decision I thought was reasonable at the time. I asked my Uncle Roy to step in. Roy Hartwell is my father's older brother. He is 74 years old, silver-haired, and the kind of man who fills a room without trying. He had been living in the guest house on my property since 2015, when his third wife left him and he showed up at my front door with 2 suitcases and a look on his face that made it impossible to say no. For 9 years I had let him stay. I paid his utilities. I covered his groceries most months. I never asked for anything back. He was family. That was what family did. He had helped me review vendor proposals a few times over the years. He knew the basics of how the business worked, or so I thought. When I needed someone to hold the wheel for 2 months, his name was the first one that came to mind. Howard Gilmore, who has been my attorney for 30 years and who has seen every version of my life, drafted the power of attorney himself. He was meticulous about it, because Howard is meticulous about everything. The document gave Roy temporary authority over routine operations only. Any contract above $50,000 required dual signatures, mine and Roy's, which effectively meant no major deals could be signed without my involvement even from a hospital bed. The authorization expired automatically after 90 days. Roy was required to submit a monthly accounting summary to Howard's office. It was airtight. Howard handed Roy the document at my kitchen table the evening before my surgery. Roy signed it without reading past the first page. I did not know that in the moment. Howard texted me after Roy left. 3 words, he did not read it. I went into surgery the next morning. I came out fine. My heart is in better shape now than it has been in a decade, which is something I try to appreciate when I remember to. I spent the first 3 weeks at home moving slowly and sleeping a lot and watching more TV than I have in my entire adult life combined. By week 4, I was back on email, reviewing small decisions, answering questions from my operations manager. By week 6, I felt mostly like myself. That was when the bank alert fired. Howard answered on the second ring. I read him the alert. He was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him typing. Then he said he needed a few hours and would call me back. He called back that afternoon. His voice had that particular flatness it gets when he is angry, but keeping it contained. The $180,000 had been wired to a vendor account I did not recognize. The vendor name was Midwest Regional Supply Partners. When Howard ran it down, the registered address was a mailbox store in Columbus, Ohio. The LLC had been created 6 weeks earlier, right around the time I went under anesthesia. Howard kept going. He had also found 3 contracts, signed by Roy, rerouting existing client relationships to a separate entity called Hartwell Distribution Partners. That LLC had been registered in Delaware. Its sole officer was my cousin Philip, Roy's son. Philip is 34 years old. He had worked a series of jobs over the years. Nothing that lasted, nothing that built toward anything. He had never worked for my company in any capacity. He had no logistics experience, no industry contacts, nothing that would qualify him to manage freight contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. But his name was on those contracts, and the contracts had been signed by Roy under the power of attorney I had granted for routine operations. I told Howard the same thing I had told myself during the 15 minutes I sat alone with that information before calling him. Do not move yet. Do not freeze anything. Do not make a single call. Just keep watching and document everything. There was going to be a party. Roy had been planning it for 2 weeks. A celebration of my recovery, held at my house, catered with 40-some guests from the local business community and a few neighbors. Roy had called it a welcome back and seemed genuinely enthusiastic about organizing it. I had thought that was kind of him. Now I understood what it actually was. It was a victory lap. He was going to stand up in my house in front of my clients and my neighbors and present himself as the man who had stepped up and saved the company while I was laid up. And once that story was established publicly, it would be much harder to unwind. I let him keep planning. I confirmed I would be there. I asked Howard to stay close to his phone that weekend. 2 days before the party, I went to an electronics store and bought a small digital voice recorder, the kind that fits in a shirt pocket. I tested it in my living room, checking the range and the clarity. It picked up conversation from across the room without any problem. I put it in the breast pocket of the jacket I planned to wear Saturday. The morning of the party, Philip's wife Lorraine called me to ask if there was anything she could bring. She had a warm voice on the phone and used the word "we" a lot, as if she and Philip were a unit operating on my behalf. She mentioned almost casually that she had been helping Roy with some of the client communication over the past few weeks. She said the clients had been very responsive. She said one of them, a procurement manager at a packaging firm we had worked with for 11 years, had asked her directly about the transition. I told her I appreciated the help. I did not tell her that the word transition had landed in my chest like a stone I hung up. I sat with it. Then I went and pressed the button on the recorder to make sure the battery was full. The party started at 6. By 6:30, the house was full. Roy had done a good job with the setup. I will give him that. There were round tables on the back patio with white linen, a bar set up near the garden wall, and a catering crew moving through the crowd with trays. I recognized about half the guests. The other half were people Roy had invited, mostly men I had seen at chamber events over the years, the kind of people who know everyone and mean nothing in particular to you. I shook hands. I accepted the well wishes. Someone from the Rotary Club told me I looked great for a man who had been through what I had been through. I thanked him and moved on. Philip was there with Lorraine. He was wearing a sport coat that was a little too new, the kind of purchase a man makes when he thinks his circumstances are about to change. Lorraine stayed close to him all evening, and twice I watched her approach guests first, before I could, and introduce herself. I did not hear exactly what she said each time. I did not need to. Roy worked the room better than anyone. He had always been good at that. He laughed easily and remembered details about people, their kids' names, where they had vacationed, what was happening with their business. He was the kind of man who made you feel like the most important person in the room when he was talking to you. That quality had served him well his whole life. It had also, I was now understanding, served a purpose I had not seen clearly until recently. At about 7:15, I found a seat near the back corner of the patio. I set my glass of water down on the table. I reached into my jacket pocket and clicked the recorder on, then I folded my hands and waited. Roy clinked his glass at 7:30. The crowd settled. He thanked everyone for coming. He said a few words about what the past couple of months had meant to the family, about the scare of the surgery, about how grateful they all were that I had come through it. It was warm and it was well delivered, and a portion of it was even true. Then he shifted. He said that during my recovery, he had taken the opportunity to evaluate the company structure. He said Hartwell Freight had been operating on models that made sense 20 years ago, but that the industry had moved on. He said he and Philip had worked to reposition some key relationships to better reflect where the freight market was heading. He used the word modernize twice. He used the phrase long-term stability once. Philip nodded from across the patio like a man who had practiced that nod. I did not move. I did not change my expression. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip and watched Roy smile at the crowd. I clicked the recorder off at 7:51. I had everything I needed. The next morning I called Howard before 8. Here's what Roy had not understood about the documents he signed. The dual signature requirement was not a formality put in there to look thorough. It was a hard legal condition. Any contract above $50,000 executed by a single authorized party was unenforceable from the moment the ink dried. Roy had signed 3 contracts rerouting existing client relationships to Phillips LLC. All 3 were above the threshold. All 3 had Roy's signature only. They were not questionable. They were void. They had been void the moment Roy handed them over. Howard sent certified letters to all 3 clients within 48 hours of my call. The letters were calm and factual. They explained the dual signature requirement from the original master service agreements each client had signed with Hartwell Freight years earlier. They explained that any subsequent agreement signed without that dual authorization had no legal standing. They did not threaten, they did not accuse. They simply laid out what was true. I called each client myself after the letters went out. The first call was to a packaging manufacturer in Indianapolis I had worked with for 11 years. His name was Gary, and he had given me some of my earliest consistent volume back when I was still running 3 trucks. I told him the situation plainly. I told him the contract he had signed with Hartwell Distribution Partners was not valid, that the entity had been created without my knowledge or authorization, and that I wanted to make it right. I offered him the same rates, the same lanes, the same service level he had always had from me. I told him I was sorry he had been put in that position. Gary was quiet for a moment, then he said he had wondered why the new paperwork had come through a different company name. He said the explanation he had been given was that it was a subsidiary restructuring. He said it had not sat right with him, but he had not known who to call. He signed a new contract with Hartwell Freight Solutions within 24 hours. The second and third clients were similar conversations. Both had questions. Both had been given the same restructuring story. Both resent within 3 days. Philip received cancellation notices from all 3 clients on the same Tuesday morning. Howard told me later that Philip had called his office 4 times that afternoon. The calls went to voicemail. Howard did not return them. I want to tell you what that Tuesday felt like, because I think it matters. I was sitting at my kitchen table again, the same table where I had taken the bank alert call 3 weeks earlier. I had a cup of coffee that was actually hot this time. Outside the window, the yard was quiet. The guest house at the far end of the property was the same as it had always looked. Same white trim. Same flower boxes Roy had put up 2 summers ago because he said the property needed color. I thought about my father. He had been a straightforward man, not wealthy, not particularly ambitious, but honest in a way that cost him sometimes. He had loved Roy in the uncomplicated way older brothers love younger ones. He would have been devastated by this. He also would have understood why I did what I did. I finished my coffee, then I called Howard and told him it was time to file the civil motion. The civil motion went in on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, the judge had signed an emergency freeze order on the $180,000 that had been wired out of the operating account. The money was sitting in a holding account connected to Phillips LLC, which made it easy to trace and easy to freeze. Howard said the judge had looked at the documentation for about 12 minutes before signing. That is how clear it was. Roy hired Bernard Alcott to represent him. I had heard the name before. Alcott was the kind of attorney who charged a lot and talked loudly and relied on the other side blinking first. He was not a bad lawyer. He was just accustomed to cases where the facts were murkier than this one. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out. I spent those 6 weeks recovering the rest of the way and letting Howard prepare. Alcott's strategy became clear in the pre-hearing filings. He was going to argue 3 things. First, that my heart surgery had impaired my judgment at the time I granted the power of attorney, meaning the document itself was compromised. Second, that Roy had acted in good faith to protect the company from operational collapse during my incapacitation. Third, that the rerouted contracts represented a legitimate restructuring effort that had been within the spirit of the authorization even if it technically exceeded the letter of it. It was not a stupid argument. If I had actually been impaired, if the records had shown confusion or instability in my thinking during recovery, it might have had legs. Howard was not concerned. The morning of the hearing, I put on a suit I had bought 2 years earlier and driven myself to the courthouse. Howard met me in the lobby. He had a rolling cart with 2 bankers' boxes on it, and the expression of a man who had done this enough times to find it boring. The courtroom was a standard county civil room, wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the smell of recycled air. Roy was already seated at the plaintiff's table with Alcott when I walked in. He was wearing a gray suit I did not recognize. He did not look at me when I sat down. Philip was in the gallery. He had come alone. Lorraine was not there. Alcott went first. He was on his feet for about 20 minutes. He described me as a man who had been through a serious medical event, who had been in a vulnerable and compromised state, who had handed authority to a trusted family member precisely because he recognized his own limitations. He described Roy as a responsible steward who had seen problems in the company's structure and had taken reasonable steps to address them. He used the word modernize twice, the same word Roy had used at the party. I wondered if Roy had written it down for him. Then he made the mistake that Alcott-type lawyers often make. He got specific. He said the dual signature clause was ambiguous in its application to restructuring transactions, and that a reasonable person could interpret temporary authority as including the power to negotiate new commercial arrangements on the company's behalf. Howard let him finish. Then Howard stood up and walked to the bench with a single manila folder. He placed 14 printed emails in front of the judge. Every one of them was sent by me during the weeks following surgery. Contract reviews, vendor dispute resolutions. Payroll approvals, each one timestamped, each one coherent, specific, and legally sound. Howard also submitted the written results of my post-surgery cognitive assessment from the 6-week follow-up appointment. The evaluating physician had noted no deficits in memory, reasoning, or executive function. Howard said one sentence about the incapacitation argument. The record did not support it. Then he put the power of attorney on the projector screen. He read the dual signature clause aloud. He read the 90-day expiration clause aloud. He put the dates of Roy's 3 contracts on the screen next to the clause. All 3 contracts had been signed within the authorization window. All 3 exceeded $50,000. None carried my signature. Howard said the second sentence. The clause was not ambiguous. Alcott tried to redirect. He argued that the spirit of the authorization encompassed business development. Howard asked him to point to the language in the document that supported that interpretation. Alcott looked at his copy. He looked at it for a while. He could not point to anything because there was nothing there. The judge, a woman named Patricia Drummond, who had been on the bench for 18 years and who had the patience of someone who has heard every version of every argument, looked at both tables and said she had seen enough to rule on the primary matter. She would issue a written decision within 3 weeks. I looked over at Roy while she was speaking. He was staring at the table in front of him. His hands were flat on the surface. He looked smaller than he had at the party. The confidence that had filled the room at the back patio was gone, and what was underneath it was just an old man who had made a very large mistake and was now sitting with the weight of it. I did not feel satisfaction in that moment. I want to be honest about that. I felt tired. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from having to protect yourself from someone who should have been protecting you. It is different from regular exhaustion. It sits lower. Philip left the gallery before the hearing officially concluded. I watched him walk out. He did not look back. Outside the courthouse, Howard and I stood in the parking lot for a few minutes. He said the ruling would almost certainly go our way. He said Alcott knew it too. I asked him what came next, and he said, "We wait, and then we collect." I drove home and changed out of the suit and sat in the backyard with a glass of iced tea. The guest house was visible from where I sat. The flower boxes were blooming. Roy had planted yellow ones this year. I looked at them for a while. Then I went inside and called Nadine Forsyth, who had been helping Howard reconstruct the overlapping accounts for the past month, and asked her if she wanted to have dinner. She said yes. Judge Drummond's written ruling came on a Wednesday morning, 19 days after the hearing. Howard called me at 8:15. He read the key findings aloud. The dual signature clause was unambiguous. The 3 contracts executed by Roy alone were void and unenforceable. The $180,000 transfer was ruled an unauthorized disbursement from a business account. Roy was ordered to return the full amount to the Hartwell Freight Solutions operating account within 30 days. He was ordered to pay $40,000 in legal fees. Phillips LLC, Hartwell Distribution Partners, was flagged with the Indiana Secretary of State's office for violations of commercial contracting law. That flag would attach to Phillips' name in the state's business registry for years. Howard paused after he finished reading. Then he said simply that it was a clean sweep. I thanked him and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while without doing anything. The ruling was the outcome I had expected. Howard had told me weeks earlier that the facts were clear enough that the only real variable was timing. But knowing something is coming and having it actually arrive are 2 different feelings. Lorraine's situation resolved separately and faster. The recording from the packaging client's compliance system, the one where she had introduced herself as a co-director of Hartwell Freight Solutions to the procurement manager, was clean and time-stamped. Howard filed a misrepresentation claim against her individually. Her attorney, a younger man who seemed genuinely surprised by the evidence, called Howard's office within a week. They settled out of court. Lorraine paid $15,000. The settlement included a statement that she had no affiliation, past or present, with Hartwell Freight Solutions in any capacity. That same week, Roy called me. I had been expecting it. I almost did not answer. Then I picked up because I thought I owed him at least that much, a conversation, even at the end of something. His voice was different on the phone than it had been at the party. The warmth was still there, the practiced ease, but underneath it something had gone loose. He said he wanted to explain. He said he had genuinely believed he was helping. He said the company had looked vulnerable while I was recovering and he had been trying to protect it. He said Philip had come to him with the restructuring idea and it had seemed like the right move at the time. I let him talk. When he finished, I said one thing. I told him that if he had believed he was helping, he would have called Howard before signing anything. He would have called me. He would have done what the document required him to do, which was check. He had not checked because checking would have stopped him and he had not wanted to be stopped. Roy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they mean they are sorry it did not work out, which is different from being sorry for what they did. I have known Roy long enough to hear the difference. I told him he had 30 days to vacate the guest house per the property management clause in the original guest agreement Howard had drafted back in 2015. Roy had signed that one without reading it either. He did not argue. He just said he understood. I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a minute. Then I went outside and walked to the far end of the yard. The guest house sat quiet in the afternoon light. The yellow flower boxes were starting to fade. I stood there and thought about my father, who had trusted Roy without reservation his entire life, and who would have found this moment genuinely painful to witness. I found it painful too. That is the part nobody tells you about being right. Being right does not stop something from hurting. Roy was gone within the 2 weeks. He did not say goodbye in person. He left a note on the kitchen table of the guest house, 2 sentences long, thanking me for the years. I read it once and put it in a drawer. The $180,000 came back to the operating account in 2 installments, the last one arriving on the 29th day of the 30-day window. Roy had liquidated a retirement account to cover it. I knew that because Howard told me, and because it was the kind of detail that makes the whole thing feel less like a legal victory and more like a family in ruins. Phillips LLC dissolved quietly over the following months. He had spent the better part of a year building something on a foundation that was never real. Whatever he had invested in the setup was gone. He had no clients, no operating history, no path forward under that name. I do not know what he did next. I did not ask, and nobody told me. Nadine Forsyth, who had spent 6 weeks rebuilding 4 years of overlapping accounts and who had found 3 additional small discrepancies that Howard had not caught on his own, became a regular presence in my life around this time. She had her own accounting practice, a good one, with clients she had built relationships with over 20 years. She was 57 years old and had no interest in anyone's money except the kind she earned herself. The first time we had dinner, she spent 40 minutes explaining a flaw in the way I had been structuring vendor payment terms. I found it genuinely interesting. That told me something useful about where things were headed. I also called Gary in Indianapolis, my oldest client, the one who had resend within 24 hours without hesitation. I took him to lunch and thanked him properly. He waved it off and said he had always known where the real company was. He said the new paperwork had never felt right to him, and he had just been waiting for someone to tell him what he already suspected. That lunch felt better than the ruling had. That is probably worth noting. 6 months after the surgery, I sold a 30% stake in Hartwell Freight Solutions to my operations manager, a woman named Beverly who had been with the company for 21 years, and who knew the routes, the clients, and the vendors better than anyone alive, including me. The sale brought in $420,000. I used a portion to clear the last of the business debt. The rest went into a personal account I have barely touched. I also bought a 1972 Ford Bronco in Grabber Blue. I had first seen one at an auto show in Indianapolis in 1991. I was 34 years old and running 4 trucks and barely keeping the lights on. And I stood next to that Bronco for probably 10 minutes longer than I should have. A man does not forget a vehicle like that. Over the years, I had priced them out a few times, come close once or twice, and always found a reason to wait. The business needed capital. The timing was not right. There was always something else. There was not something else anymore. The Bronco needed work when I bought it, which was part of the appeal. I spent 3 months in the garage on weekends, learning what the previous owner had done right and undoing what he had done wrong. Nadine came over on Saturday afternoons sometimes and read in the kitchen while I worked. She did not pretend to be interested in the mechanical side of it, which I respected. She brought good coffee and did not talk too much, which covered everything I needed. By October, the Bronco was road ready. Nadine had a conference in Traverse City that month. I had nothing scheduled and no reason to stay home. We took back roads most of the way north through Michigan, through small towns with grain elevators and diners with hand-lettered signs and long flat stretches where you could see the sky from one horizon to the other. The Bronco rode loud and the heater took a while to warm up and neither of us minded. Somewhere north of Gaylord, I thought about Roy. I thought about him for maybe 2 or 3 miles. I thought about the Sunday dinners we had shared, about the way he used to help me stack firewood in October, because his back was better than mine in those years, about a fishing trip we had taken to Lake Erie when I was in my 40s, and he was the one who caught everything. I thought about the fact that none of that was fabricated. The warmth had been real at some point in some form. I also thought about the morning I found out he had signed those contracts, the way the information had landed, the particular feeling of being robbed by someone you had chosen to trust. Then the road curved north and the trees opened up and there was a lake off to the left catching the afternoon light. And I stopped thinking about Roy. Not because I forced myself to, just because the lake was there and it was worth looking at. That is the thing about building a life the right way over a long time. It gives you enough real things to look at that the bad ones eventually stop filling the frame. Beverly is running the day-to-day operations now. The 3 clients are still with us, the books are clean, and Howard reviews them every quarter. I consult when Beverly wants a second opinion, which is less often than I expected and more often than I probably deserve credit for. The company is in better shape than it was before the surgery, which is either a testament to Beverly or an indictment of how much I had been holding on out of habit, probably some of both. Nadine and I had dinner last Friday at a place she likes near the river. She spent part of the meal walking me through a tax structure she was setting up for a new client, talking it through out loud the way she does when she is working something out. I followed most of it. She did not slow down for the parts I missed, which I also respect. She is the first person in a long time who has not adjusted herself to fit what she thought I needed. I do not know what Roy is doing now. I know he left Fort Wayne because Howard's office received a forwarding address in a different city when they sent the final legal correspondence. I know Phillips LLC is dissolved and his name is flagged in the state registry. I know Lorraine paid her settlement. Beyond that, I have not looked. It is not indifference exactly. It is more that the chapter is closed and I do not have a reason to reopen it. Some doors close because someone slams them. Some close because you finally stop propping them open. This one was the second kind. I built Hartwell Freight from a garage with 1 truck and a handshake. I kept it for 40 years through recessions and fuel spikes and a freight market that changed completely 3 times over. I almost lost it to someone I let inside my own home, but almost is not the same as did. If you have spent your life building something real and someone who was supposed to stand beside you tried to take it while you were not looking, then you already know what I'm talking about. You know the specific weight of that betrayal. You also know that the answer is not rage. The answer is preparation. The answer is building things carefully enough that even the people who know you cannot dismantle what you made. You built it right. It holds. That is true for freight companies and for everything else worth keeping. If that lands where I think it does, hit like and leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done differently. And subscribe if you want more stories about men who did the work and refused to let it be taken from them.